Only a fool would marry a pauper, Edmund Harrowby said, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear, and the Duke of Dunmoor, standing unseen in the shadow of a marble column, felt something cold and precise turn over in his chest. He had not meant to attend the Fenwick assembly at all. Alaric, 7th Duke of Dunmoor, made a habit of arriving late to such things and leaving early, and of speaking to no one he was not obliged to speak to. But he had come tonight to satisfy a debt of manners to old Lord Fenwick, and now he stood half in darkness at the edge of the great room, watching a young man in an embroidered waistcoat break an engagement in the most public manner Alaric had ever witnessed. The young man was Harrowby, heir to a comfortable fortune, a face made for portraits and for very little else. And the woman before him stood very straight, in a gown that had been fashionable perhaps 4 seasons ago, its lace mended with a hand so careful the mending was nearly invisible, unless you knew to look. Alaric knew to look. He noticed such things the way other men notice the fall of cards. "You cannot mean this here," the young woman said. Her voice did not shake, though Alaric could see the cost of keeping it steady in the white knuckles of her gloved hand. "Edmund, whatever you must say to me, say it in private, for the sake of—" "For the sake of what?" Harrowby laughed, and the sound carried. Heads were turning now all along the room, fans lowering, conversations dying into that particular hush that gathers around cruelty the way crows gather around a fallen thing. "For the sake of your father's name. Your father is dead, Marian, and he left you nothing but debt and a leaking roof. I was fond of you. I will not pretend otherwise, but a man in my position cannot afford fondness. I need a wife with a dowry, not a wife I must rescue from her creditors. Marian." Alaric turned the name over in his mind and did not know why he did. "You gave me your word," she said. "I gave you a word when your circumstances were different. Circumstances change." Harrowby's gaze flicked around the watching room, gathering his audience, and Alaric understood then that the cruelty was not incidental. It was a performance. The young fool wanted witnesses. He wanted the whole of society to see him cut loose the penniless girl before anyone could accuse him of having jilted a lady who deserved better. He was making himself the sensible one, the practical one, and making her the fool. "Come, Marian, do not make a scene of it. Only a fool would marry a pauper, and I am not a fool. Surely even you can see the sense in that." The room waited. Alaric watched the young woman's face and expected, as everyone in that room expected, that she would break, that she would weep or flee or plead, and give them all the spectacle they had come in the end to see. Society loved nothing so much as a beautiful girl brought low. They would speak of it for a month. They would pity her at first, and then, tiring of pity, they would begin to say that perhaps Harrowby had been wise, that there had always been something desperate about the Ashcombe girl, that a woman with no fortune ought to have known her place. She did not break. She lifted her chin the smallest degree, and she looked at Edmund Harrowby the way a queen might look at a servant who had forgotten himself, and she said quite clearly, "Then I am glad to learn the measure of you now, sir, and not after I had bound my life to it. I wish you every joy of your dowry. I am sure it will keep you warmer than I could have." And she turned to go. It should have ended there. She had won the exchange if anyone with sense had been listening. She had answered scorn with dignity and left him holding the cruelty in his own 2 hands. But society had no interest in her dignity, and Harrowby, stung that his practical little speech had been turned into something that made him look small, could not let her have the last word. "Go where?" he called after her, and now his voice had an ugly edge. "Back to your mortgaged house. Back to sell your mother's rings. Look at her, all of you. She wears mended lace to a duke's assembly and thinks herself too fine for the man who was kind enough to offer for her. There is your proud pauper. There is Miss Marian Ashcombe, who is nothing and behaves as though she owns the room." Laughter then. Not from everyone, but from enough. The particular thin, cruel laughter of people relieved that the humiliation belonged to someone else. And Alaric watched the young woman's back, her straight shoulders, watched her take one more step toward the door and then falter, just slightly. As the laughter reached her, watched the moment when dignity was no longer enough to hold a person upright, when the room's contempt began to do what Harrowby's words alone had not. Alaric of Dunmoor was not a man who acted on impulse. He had spent 38 years learning to distrust the swift movements of the heart, because the swift movements of the heart had cost his family a great deal in their time. He was called in the drawing rooms of 3 counties the Cold Duke, the Iron Duke of Dunmoor, a man who had buried a father and a brother and a great deal else besides, and had emerged from it all with a face that gave away nothing. He did not decide to move. He simply found that he was moving. He stepped out of the shadow of the column and into the light of the great chandeliers, and the effect of it was immediate, a ripple of awareness passing through the room as people registered who had appeared among them. The Duke of Dunmoor, who never came to these things, who had not been seen in society in longer than most of them could remember. The laughter died. Fans stilled. Edmund Harrowby's practiced sneer wavered as he tried to work out what a duke's arrival meant for the little scene he had been conducting. Alaric crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life needed to ask permission to occupy a space, and the crowd parted before him without being asked, and he came to a stop directly in the path of Marian Ashcombe, so that she could not leave without going through him. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She had not let herself weep, and Alaric felt an odd surge of respect for that, for the sheer stubbornness of it. But they were bright with the effort of holding everything back, and there was in them a wariness so deep it was nearly its own kind of exhaustion. She had learned, he understood at once, to expect nothing good from powerful men. She was waiting to discover what fresh humiliation a duke intended to add to the pile. "Your Grace," she said and curtsied, because that was what one did, even when one's whole world had just come apart in front of 200 people. "Miss Ashcombe," Alaric said. He had not known he knew her name until he said it. He must have caught it from Harrowby's mouth. But something in the saying of it aloud in the quiet room in his own low, steady voice made the young woman go very still, as though no one had spoken her name kindly in a long while, and she had forgotten what it sounded like. Alaric turned his head, unhurried, and looked at Edmund Harrowby. "You said," he remarked, in a voice that carried effortlessly to every corner of the silent room, "that only a fool would marry a pauper." Harrowby's throat worked. "Your Grace, it was a private matter." It did not sound private. Alaric let the words fall like stones into still water. "You made quite certain it was heard." "I heard it. Everyone here heard it. So I should like to answer you, since you have made your opinion a matter of public record." He paused, and the pause was terrible, and Harrowby seemed to shrink inside his fine embroidered waistcoat. "You are correct. Only a fool would marry a woman he does not deserve, and then abandon her the moment his own comfort is threatened, and call it wisdom. That is a kind of fool I have no wish to be." He turned back to Marian Ashcombe, and the Duke of Dunmoor, who had not offered his hand to a woman in 15 years, who had told his aunts and his solicitors and his own reflection that he had no intention of marrying at all, extended his hand toward the penniless girl in the mended lace, palm up, in the middle of the Fenwick ballroom, before them all. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, and his voice had gone quieter now, meant for her and yet still audible to the breathless room, because he wanted them all to hear it. "I am aware this is neither the time nor the manner in which such a thing ought to be done. But I find I have no patience left for doing things in the proper manner. You have been insulted before witnesses, and I will not stand among the witnesses and say nothing. So I ask you plainly and before them all, will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" For a long moment Marian Ashcombe did not move. Alaric could see the war going on behind her eyes. She was a proud woman and a clever one, and no clever woman took a duke's outstretched hand in a public ballroom without wondering what it would cost her. She would be thinking that this was another performance, another man arranging her humiliation for his own purposes, that a duke did not simply choose a pauper out of the air, that there must be a trick in it, a cruelty she had not yet seen the shape of. "Your Grace," she said very low, "if you mean this as a kindness, I would rather you did not. I have had enough of being an object of other people's pity for one evening. I would rather walk home in the rain with my dignity than be married out of charity." Something in Alaric warmed toward her then, sharply and completely, in a way he had not expected and did not entirely trust. "It is not charity," he said. "I have never in my life done anything out of charity. Ask anyone in this room. They will tell you I am the coldest man in 3 counties, and they will not be wrong. I do not offer you my hand to save you." He looked at her steadily. I offer it because in the last 3 minutes I have watched you insulted before 200 people, and you did not weep, and you did not beg, and you answered a small man with more grace than he will manage in his whole life. I have sat through a great many assemblies full of women who were raised to be exactly what society wished them to be, and I have never once wanted to marry any of them. You are the first person in this room I have found worth speaking to. That is not charity, Miss Ashcombe. That is the plainest self-interest you will ever encounter. A sound went through the crowd, not laughter now, but something else, a kind of astonished murmur, and Alaric saw the thing he had hoped to see. He saw Marian Ashcombe understand that he meant it. She put her hand in his. Fingers were cold through the glove, and they trembled once and then were still, and Alaric closed his hand around hers and felt, absurdly, as though he had reached out to steady someone and had instead been steadied himself. Then, yes, your grace. He did not smile. Alaric of Dunmoor was not much given to smiling, and the whole of society would have fallen down in shock to see it, but something eased in the hard line of his mouth, and he raised her cold, trembling hand and bowed over it, and pressed his lips very briefly to the mended glove, before them all. The ballroom erupted. Not into applause, society did not applaud a scandal, but into a roar of whispers, 100 fans snapping open, 100 voices turning to their neighbours to be sure they had truly seen what they had seen. The Duke of Dunmoor, the Iron Duke. Betrothed, in the space of a quarter hour, to the penniless Ashcombe girl, the very woman Edmund Harrowby had cast off not 5 minutes before as beneath his notice. And Edmund Harrowby stood in the middle of it all with his face the colour of ash, having just been made, before the entire assembled society of 3 counties, into precisely the fool he had accused everyone else of being. He had thrown away a woman a duke wanted. He had called her worthless, publicly, minutes before a duke of ancient name had chosen her over every heiress in the room. There was no recovering from a thing like that. Everyone present understood it in the same instant. For the rest of his life, Edmund Harrowby would be the man who let the Duchess of Dunmoor slip through his fingers because she had mended her own lace. Alaric looked at him once, briefly, without any particular heat. "You may go, Mr. Harrowby," he said, as one might dismiss a footman. "I imagine you have a great deal to think about." Harrowby went. He left the ballroom with the stiff, blind walk of a man who has just watched his whole future rearrange itself against him, and Alaric did not trouble to watch him go. He had already forgotten him. His attention had narrowed entirely to the woman whose hand was still in his, whose eyes were fixed on his face with an expression he could not read, disbelief and hope and terror all at once. The look of a person who has learned so thoroughly to expect the worst that a piece of unlooked-for good fortune arrives like a threat. "You need not look at me so," he said quietly, only for her. "I do not intend to change my mind." "Everyone changes their mind about me eventually, Your Grace," she said. It was not self-pity. It was only fact, spoken flatly the way one might report the weather. "Then I shall have to be the first who does not," said Alaric. "Come. I will take you home. This room has had quite enough of us both." He drew a hand through his arm and led her from the ballroom, and the crowd parted for them as it had parted for him alone before, only now every eye was on the woman at his side, the mended lace, the 4 seasons old gown, the straight proud back. And Alaric felt her spine straighten under all that attention, felt her decide, somewhere between the chandeliers and the door, that she would not let them see her flinch. He liked her the better for it. His carriage was among the finest in the county, all lacquer and dark leather, and the Dunmoor crest picked out in silver on the door, and when the footman handed Marian up into it she paused on the step and looked back at the great lit house. The faces crowded now at every window to watch the Duke of Dunmoor drive away with his impossible bride, and Alaric watched her look at them, and watched her turn away without expression, and settle herself in the corner of the seat with her hands folded in her lap as though she rode in dukes' carriages every evening of her life. They drove for some minutes in silence. The rain had begun in earnest, a soft steady drumming on the carriage roof, and the lamps of the town slid past the glass, gold and then dark, gold and then dark. "You may tell me now," Marian said at last, "why you truly did it. I would rather know. I have found it is always better to know the terms of a thing at the beginning." Alaric considered the question. He was not, by nature, a man who explained himself. But there was something in her steadiness that seemed to deserve an honest answer, and he found he wished to give her one. "My brother married for love," he said, "against the family's wishes, against every sensible objection. He married a woman with no fortune and no connection, a parson's daughter, because he could not imagine his life without her. My father never forgave it. He cut my brother off, refused his letters, refused to receive his wife, refused even to acknowledge the marriage. And then my brother died quite young of a fever, before any of it could be mended. And his wife died not 2 years after of grief and want, in a set of cheap rooms in a town I had never troubled to visit, because I too had done nothing, because I too had let my father's coldness stand for my own." He paused. The rain drummed on. "I have spent a great many years, Miss Ashcombe, being ashamed of the man I was on that occasion. Tonight I stood in a ballroom and watched a small man cast off a good woman for want of money, and watched a room full of people prepare to enjoy it, and I found I could not be that man again. So I stepped forward. That is the whole of it. It is not a romance. It is only that I have failed a woman before badly, and I did not intend to do it twice." Marian was quiet for a long moment. When he glanced at her in the sliding lamplight, he saw that her eyes were wet at last, not from her own grief, he understood, but from his. "That is a very sad reason to marry a stranger," she said softly. "It is the truest reason I have," Alaric answered. "And I have found that true reasons wear better than pretty ones." The carriage slowed. They had reached the Ashcombe house, a narrow, sensible-looking place on the edge of the town, respectable once and now visibly struggling, the paint gone grey, one of the upper shutters hanging crooked, a look of genteel exhaustion about the whole of it. Marian looked at it through the glass, and Alaric saw her brace herself, saw her prepare for him to see it, to judge it, to think less of her for it. "It is not much," she said before he could speak, the words coming out too quickly. "My father was not a man of business. He was a kind man and a foolish one, and he loved me, and he left me a great deal of debt in this house, and I have kept the house as long as I could, but I think—" She stopped. "I think I would have lost it by the spring. Edmund knew that. It is why he chose tonight to be rid of me. He did not wish to be married to a woman without even a house to her name." "Then Edmund Harrowby is exactly the fool he called others," Alaric said. "Miss Ashcombe, I own 11 houses, and I have never once been happy in any of them. You have kept a difficult house alone, in mourning, in debt, and you have kept your back straight while a room full of people laughed at you. I am not concerned about the paint." He kept his word about calling. He called the very next morning, before the town had finished spreading the tale of the night before, and he found the Ashcombe house in a state of quiet siege, the drawing-room curtains half drawn, a stack of unpaid accounts turned face down on the little writing table, and Marian herself standing very upright in the middle of it all, as though she expected him to have come to laugh at her in the daylight, now that the enchantment of the ballroom had worn off. "You look surprised to see me," Alaric observed, handing his hat and gloves to the single elderly servant who kept the house. "I confess I am," Marian said. "I lay awake half the night certain that a footman would arrive this morning with a note, some polite retraction, regret, and a small sum, and a request that I speak of it to no one. You thought I would pay you to forget I had asked you. Men of your position generally arrange their mistakes so quietly," she said. "I did not think you would be an exception. I hope you will forgive me for it. I have been given a great many reasons to expect the worst." Alaric did not take offence. He rather admired the plainness of it. He sat uninvited in the shabby drawing-room, in a chair whose upholstery had been mended as carefully as her lace, and he looked at her until she sat too. "I do not make mistakes I need to arrange quietly afterward," he said. "I have made 2 great mistakes in my life, and I have spent years living with the consequences of both, and I have learned from them the only lesson worth learning, which is to decide slowly, and then not to unpick the decision afterward out of cowardice. I decided last night. I have not changed my mind in the night, and I shall not change it now. Now, you have a stack of accounts turned face down on that table, and you turned them down when I came in, and I would like you to turn them back over." Marian's chin came up. "Those are my affairs, Your Grace." "They are about to be mine," he said, not unkindly. "You objected last night to being married out of charity, and I honoured the objection, Because you were right, charity is a poor foundation for anything. But we are to be husband and wife, and a wife's debts are her husband's, and I would rather begin honestly than have you hide the state of things from me out of pride. I have had enough of pride. My father was the proudest man in England, and it killed my brother. Turn them over. For a long moment she did not move. Then, slowly, with the air of a woman bearing a wound, she turned the accounts face up and pushed them across the little table toward him, and Alaric read them in silence. The butcher, the coal merchant, the mortgage on the house. The small persistent depths of a household kept going on hope and mending, and he saw in them the whole shape of the last 2 years of her life, the thousand small economies, the long quiet fight to keep one narrow house from sinking, and he felt his opinion of Edmund Harrowby, which had already been very low, descend somewhere below the level of the floor. You have carried this alone, he said at last. There was no one to carry it with me. There is now. He set the papers down. These will be settled by the end of the week. Not as charity, as the ordinary business of a marriage, which is the joining of two people's whole lives, the debts along with the rest. You need never turn a paper face down in front of me again. Do you understand me, Miss Ashcombe? Not the debts, and not anything else. I did not choose a woman to hide things from me. I have had a house full of silence for 15 years, and I want no more of it. Something in Marian's carefully held composure cracked, just slightly, and she looked down at her folded hands, and when she spoke her voice was not quite steady. You are being very kind to me, she said, and I do not know how to bear it. I know how to bear cruelty, your grace. I have had a great deal of practice. I do not know at all how to bear this. Then we shall both be learning something, Alaric said, for I do not know how to be kind. I am told I have no talent for it whatsoever. We shall have to be patient with each other while we teach ourselves. She laughed, the small sound he had wanted to hear again, and it undid something in his chest to hear it, and she wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, quite without ceremony, and looked up at him, and for the first time the wariness in her face was not there. In its place was something Alaric had no name for, but which warmed him from across the shabby little room like a fire. He called the next day, and the next. He came at first, he told himself, out of duty. A man ought to know the woman he was to marry, but the duty worn very quickly, and what remained was something else, something he had not felt in so long he had trouble recognizing it. He simply wished to be where she was. He found excuses. He brought her a book he thought she might like and discovered she had read it twice already and disagreed with half of it, and they argued about it for the better part of an hour, and Alaric drove home afterward and realized with something like alarm that he had enjoyed himself. He walked with her in the small neglected garden behind the house and listened to her name the plants her father had planted, and heard in the naming how much she had loved the foolish, kind man who had left her nothing but debt, and understood that she was a woman who loved fiercely and without stint and had simply been given, thus far, very little worth the loving. He resolved to become worth it. There was one evening in that first married winter that Alaric would remember for the rest of his life. Old Lady Fenwick, whose husband had first drawn him to the fatal assembly, held a card party in December, and it was the first true society occasion the new Duchess of Dunmoor was to attend since the wedding, the first time the gossips of 3 counties would have her in a room to inspect at their leisure. Alaric knew what they intended. He had lived among these people all his life, and he knew precisely how they meant to test her, with 100 small cruelties dressed as courtesy, with pointed inquiries after her family, with the studied astonishment of women who wished her to feel every inch the pauper who had married above herself. He had half a mind to refuse the invitation, but Marian would not hear of it. If I hide from them now, she said, drawing on her gloves. Good gloves, new gloves, though Alaric noticed she still kept the old mended pair in a drawer, and never said why, and he never asked. I shall be hiding from them for the rest of my life, and I have hidden from quite enough. Let them look. I would rather be looked at once and have it done. So they went, and the room did exactly as Alaric had known it would. There was Mrs. Danbury, who inquired with great sweetness whether the Duchess found the great houses very cold after her own more modest establishment. There was Lady Crewe, who wondered aloud whether it must not be difficult to manage servants when one had, after all, so lately been nearly a servant oneself. There was the whole soft chorus of it, the cruelty that wore a smile, and Alaric stood at the edge of the room with his jaw hard and his temper rising and watched his wife walk into the middle of it. She did not flinch. He had known she would not, and still it moved him to see it. She answered Mrs. Downbury that she found the great houses no colder than any house whose owner had forgotten to light it, and that she had lately been employed in lighting a good many. She told Lady Crewe that she had indeed nearly been a servant, and that she had learned a great deal from the prospect, chiefly how to tell the difference between a person of quality and a person of mere fortune, which she had found, she said mildly, to be two entirely different things, and more rarely combined than one might hope. She said it all without heat, without spite, with a serene good humour that gave her tormentors nothing to seize upon, and one by one they fell back before her, because there is nothing so disarming to cruelty as a person who simply refuses to be wounded by it. And Alaric, watching from across the room, felt his chest fill with something so large he could hardly contain it. He had married her, he had told himself, out of shame and duty and the memory of his brother. He understood, watching her that night, that this was no longer true if it had ever wholly been. He watched her turn away the sharpest women in the county with a smile, and he thought, I love her. The realization arrived without drama, quietly, the way the true things always did with him, not a thunderclap, but a settling. A piece of furniture moved at last into the place it had always been meant to stand. He loved her. He had loved her, perhaps, since the ballroom, since the moment she lifted her chin and told Edmund Harrowby she was glad to know the measure of him now. He crossed the room to her, and she turned as he came. And the smile she gave him was different from the one she had been giving her tormentors all evening, warmer, unguarded, meant only for him, and he offered her his arm and drew her a little apart, into the shelter of a window bay, away from the watching room. You have routed them all, he murmured. I came to rescue you and find there is nothing left to rescue you from. There never was, she said, but I am glad you came. I am always glad when you come. She looked up at him, and the candlelight caught in her eyes, and she said more softly, You are looking at me strangely, Alaric. Am I? You are. You are looking at me the way you looked at me in the ballroom, as though you have just decided something. I have, said Alaric. I decided it some minutes ago, across the room, while you were dismantling Lady Crewe. I had rather thought I would tell you somewhere more private, but I find I have no patience for doing things in the proper manner. I believe I have said as much to you before. And there, in the window bay of Lady Fenwick's card party, with half the county pretending not to watch, the Duke of Dunmoor told his wife that he loved her, quietly, plainly, without ornament, in the same low, steady voice with which he had offered her his hand 3 months before. And he watched her face change, watched the last of the worriness she had carried since the ballroom fall away entirely, watched her understand that this too was true as everything else he had told her, that she was not a duty or a debt or a penance, but a woman a proud, cold man had come, against all his own expectations, to love. She could not answer him for a moment. When she did, it was only his name spoken like the last word of a prayer. I know I have been a great while getting to it, Alaric said. You must forgive me. I am out of practice at nearly everything worth doing. But I did not wish another year to pass without your knowing, in case. He did not finish. They both knew what he meant. He was thinking of his brother, and of a woman who had died of grief and want with ever being told by the family she married into that she was wanted. And Marian understood, and reached up and laid her gloved hand against his hard cheek, there in front of everyone, and did not care in the least who saw. They drove home through the snow with her head on his shoulder, and neither of them spoke, because there was no longer any need. A small sound escaped her, half a laugh, half something else, and she pressed her gloved fingers briefly to her lips, and Alaric found that he wanted, quite badly, to make her make that sound again. He handed her down himself into the rain, and walked her to her own door under the shelter of his coat, and at the threshold she turned to him, and for the first time all evening she did not look wary. She looked instead, as though she were seeing him, truly seeing him, the man and not the title, the way he had looked at her across the ballroom and seen a person and not a scandal. Your Grace, she said. Alaric, his given name, offered like a gift, testing the shape of it. I do not know what sort of marriage this is to be. I do not know if you will grow to regret it, or if I will only ever be the woman you rescued out of shame. But I want you to know that whatever it is, I will be honest in it. You have had a great deal of dishonesty tonight, from a man who gave you his word and broke it. You will not have it from me. That is all I have to offer you. I have no dowry and no connections and no fine things, but I have that, and I will give it to you gladly. Alaric looked at her for a long moment in the rain and the lamplight, and he thought that in 15 years no one had offered him anything without wanting something larger in return. He said, "Is worth a great deal more than a dowry. Good night, Miss Ashcombe. I will call tomorrow, and every day after, until you are tired of me. I suspect it will take some time." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small stone church of the Dunmoor estate, with none of the society that had watched the betrothal in attendance. Alaric had made certain of that. He had no wish to give the gossips a second performance. He married her quietly, in the morning light, with a handful of servants and the parson to see it, and Marian wore a gown of pale grey silk that he had ordered made for her, and that fit her as though it had grown on her. And she carried white roses from the Dunmoor gardens, and when she came up the aisle toward him, Alaric found that the coldness he had worn for 15 years like a suit of armour did not seem to fit him any more. The gossips, of course, did not fall silent so easily. There were those who said the Duke of Dunmoor had gone mad. There were those who said the Ashcombe girl had trapped him with some artful scheme, though no one could ever say quite what the scheme had been. There were those, chiefly Edmund Harrowby's remaining friends, who put it about that the marriage would not last the year, that a duke would tire of a penniless wife, that the whole thing had been a caprice. They were wrong. It became known in the drawing-rooms of 3 counties that the Iron Duke of Dunmoor had thawed, that he had begun to attend assemblies again, always with his Duchess on his arm, and that he watched her across every room with an expression no one had ever seen on his face before. That the Dunmoor estate, which had been shut and grey and half in mourning for years, had thrown open its shutters, that there were flowers in the great hall again, that the Duchess had reopened the school in the village, that the old Duke had let fall into ruin, that she knew the name of every tenant's family and the state of every leaking roof, and that she had a gift, everyone agreed, for making a person feel seen, as though she remembered, from her own hard years, exactly what it was to be overlooked, and had resolved that no one under her care would ever feel it again. And Alaric watched her do it, month after month, and understood more clearly with each passing week that he had not, in fact, rescued her at all. She had needed no rescuing. She had needed only for one person of consequence to look at her and see what was there, and having been seen, she had unfolded into exactly the woman he had glimpsed for a moment in a ballroom, and kind and unbreakable, and worth more than every heiress who had ever been paraded before him. As for Edmund Harrowby, he married his dowry in the end, a thin, nervous heiress with a large fortune and a small heart, and the marriage was, by all accounts, a cold one. Society did not forget what he had said. It never does. For the rest of his life, at every assembly, there was always someone to remind him, with the particular pleasure people take in another man's folly, that he had once stood in a ballroom and called the future Duchess of Dunmoor a pauper not worth a fool's regard. Minutes before a duke made her his own, he had wanted witnesses. He got them. They simply remembered the wrong thing. Alaric did not think of him at all, as it happened. He had far better things to think of. He thought of them one evening in early winter, a year after the Fenwick Assembly, standing at the long windows of Dunmoor Library with his wife beside him, and the first snow falling grey and soft over the park. Marian had a letter in her hand, some small matter of the village school, and she was frowning over it in the firelight in a way he had grown to love, and Alaric watched the firelight move on her face, and thought that he had spent 38 years being told that he was a cold man, and that he had believed it, and that it had never once been true. He had only been waiting, without knowing it, for a reason to be otherwise. "You are staring at me, your grace," Marian said, without looking up from her letter. "I am," said Alaric. "I intend to go on doing it. You may consider it one of the terms of the marriage." She looked up then, and smiled at him, the whole, unguarded smile that she had never once shown that watching ballroom, that she showed only to him, in rooms with no one else in them, and set the letter down, and came to stand beside him at the window, and he put his arm around her and drew her in against his side. And they stood together and watched the snow come down over the land that was hers now as much as his. "Do you know," she said quietly after a while, "I have never once thanked you. Not properly. For the ballroom, for stepping out of that shadow. You need not," Alaric said. "You have thanked me every day since, in ways you do not even notice. And in any case, you have the whole of it backward." He looked down at her. "I did not save you, Marian. I have known that for months and been too proud to say it. You were never the one drowning. I had been for 15 years, without ever once admitting it. You are the reason there is anyone at all left standing here to watch the snow. It was you who came into a cold house and made it a home. It was you who reached out your hand." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I only had the good sense, for once in my life, to take it." Outside, the snow went on falling, soft and endless, over the roofs of the tenants who knew her name, over the reopened school, over the grey church where he had married her in the morning light, and inside in the warm gold of the fire. The Iron Duke of Dunmoor held his impossible wife against his heart, and thought that of all the things he had ever owned, the 11 houses, the ancient name, the great cold fortune, the only one he could not have borne to lose was the one that had cost him nothing at all, and had been given to him freely by a woman in mended lace who had refused to weep. He had called it self-interest that first night, and told her it was the plainest thing she would ever encounter. He had been wrong about that, as it turned out. It had a much older name. He held her closer and did not correct the record, and was, for the first time in his long cold life, entirely content.